this is part of a 6-part series on land justice. The series is called Tending the Soil Towards Land Justice in Connecticut. And I am Malana. I work as a project coordinator at Wesleyan University in the College of the Environment. My work is really focused on kind of community engagement around food justice, environmental justice, and as we've been doing that work, we've been seeing that land justice is something that folks really wanted to think more about. Like, what is land justice? How do we get into more right relationship with the land, with each other? What does that look like? What are some of the injustices that we're facing around land in our communities, especially as BIPOC folks, and what are some of the ways we want to address that as a community, both like learning from national examples, international examples, but also local examples, things that we're seeing here in Connecticut. So the first workshop we had was Land Justice 101, then we had International Land Back, and now we're having this workshop around planning and zoning. We're also looking forward to workshops around community land trusts, one next month, and then BIPOC farmers in Connecticut, and then also green social housing. So it's been really informative. I think we're all learning a lot about like what this movement could look like, how we could grow this movement around land justice, and I think the planning and zoning piece is also especially important. So yeah, the bathrooms are right in this hallway, and there's also some resources there that Aimee's put out. Are those to take as well? That you could take, browse them as well, but if you want to take something home, that are about planning and zoning. And and also this is being recorded, and we're going to be distributing that as well. So if there's any reason why you don't want to be in the recording, if you're in the room, please let me know. But this will also be recorded for folks who weren't able to make it today to be able to access that. So I do want to introduce Aimee. This is Aimee Chambers. Aimee works as the Planning and Zoning Director for the City of Boston Planning Department. She joined the team in January 2023 after serving as the Planning and Zoning Director in Hartford for 4 years. In that role, Chambers was responsible for long and short-term planning, zoning enforcement, transportation planning, and historic preservation. She has worked across the nonprofit and public sectors as a planner and project manager focused on community engagement, governance, and systems improvement, and disaster recovery, including with the State of Louisiana Office of Community Development Disaster Recovery Unit. In a former life, Chambers worked as a foster care case manager and a DJ. She is a music lover, traveler, dog mom, 2019 Next City Vanguard in Newark, New Jersey, a small business owner of Semilla, where we are right now, and a firm believer in the power of third spaces. Aimee was also nominated in Connecticut Magazine's 40 Under 40 class of 2022, and she graduated from Manhattan College and University of Maryland College Park. So yeah, welcome, Aimee.
Hi, everyone. So I was on my way down here this morning from Boston, and I was on the phone with a friend because I come back and forth a lot to be at the shop on the weekends, and so I use that time to talk to my friends on the phone. And my friend asked me what I was doing today, and I told him about this workshop, and he went online and read the bio and was like, that makes you sound very serious, and you are an extremely unserious person, so I actually hate it and wish that we could tweak it a little bit. So that's what I was thinking about while Malana was reading that. But thank you for the introduction, and thanks for having me. We are going to talk a bit today, as Malana mentioned, about planning and zoning from the kind of historic lens of inequity, and we'll end by talking a little bit about where planning and zoning specifically are kind of attempting to go today. I am happy to, at any point in time during the next 2 hours, take questions. We can also reserve questions to the end, whatever kind of works for you all. And I'm just hoping to make this an interactive afternoon. So thanks for being here. So I wanted to just begin by saying that I'm going to intentionally focus on contemporary history. Obviously, there is much that comes before like the last century, but I'm going to spend most of the time today talking about the last century. So as you can see here, I have an image. Do you folks know where this is from? Yeah. Up. Yeah, the movie Up. So in the movie Up, Carl Fredricksen, who is voiced by Ed Asner, is in a bit of a bind. For more than half a century, he has lived in the same house, a quaint two-story Victorian with scalloped shingles and a modest front porch. Once upon a time, it was just a boarded-up hovel consumed by overgrowth, not unlike 320 Sycamore from It's a Wonderful Life. But it has good bones. Carl and his wife Ellie bought it for a song and quickly got to work on their fixer-upper project, sawing and hammering and shellacking away to realize their slice of domestic bliss. Today, Carl is a widowed octogenarian with a resting scowl face who gets around using a crane. The house still stands, just a bit worse for the wear, but the neighborhood has been transformed by rapid development and upzoning. Scaffolding and steel girders now cast long shadows, making way for office towers and luxury condos. A tanning salon, a sushi restaurant have opened across the street, clear markings of urban development boom in full swing. Jackhammers and construction trucks have supplanted singing birds and rustling leaves as the soundtrack to Carl's life. But Carl holds fast to his property no matter how much money or airborne toxins are thrown in his face. It is only when he is removed by force that he inevitably becomes creative, stringing thousands of helium balloons to the andirons on his fireplace, lifting the house off its foundation and escaping once and for all through the soulless urban sprawl. Great movie. So I wanted to just start with something kind of recognizable. I love this movie. And if you haven't seen it, you should watch it. It is actually based on a real house on the West Coast, and it is very similar to a Connecticut land use law case as well. And just generally, planning and zoning and all of its byproducts and consequences can feel super endless and super heady. I'm going to try to not use planning jargon today, but definitely yell at me if you catch me doing it. And I'm going to talk a little bit about just the basics of planning and zoning, some of the history, and how it manifests itself locally. And obligatory disclaimer, I am not speaking in my professional capacity. So I want to recognize both the limitations and failures of government, and I want to talk about that honestly today. Before we get started, because we're a hybrid meeting, I am using a little survey tool online. If folks wouldn't mind pulling out their phones, I have just a few questions to kind of gauge who's in the room, both physically and virtually. And let's see. Okay, so once you have logged into Mentimeter, this is just a tool that we use sometimes in public meetings to get information back. You can answer these questions. I'm curious about how much folks know about how planning and zoning impacts daily life. All right, we will come back to this page. Awesome, thank you for participating in that. So I, again, did that just to make sure that we all kind of have a little bit of an eye for who is in the room and also who's not in the room. So where our discussion kind of goes on the basis of both of those things. So start with a little thesis statement. Design informs both, Design both informs and reflects policy. It is a reflection of what we as urbanists or anti-urbanists value, and everything is purposeful. Today we're going to talk about the history of racism in America, which includes and manifests itself through spatial injustice. So down to the basics. So first, we're going to just name kind of what is planning and then what is zoning. So planning is a process that is meant to shape how a community changes over time. Oftentimes when I tell people I'm a planner, they think I'm talking about events. I also like planning events, but that is not what I do for a living. Planners are folks, oftentimes we're talking about municipal employees or state employees, but planners definitely work kind of throughout lots of different sectors. Here I'm referring kind of specifically to government employees. So folks who participate in the whole process of defining vision for the future of a community, gathering public feedback, synthesizing information into actionable documents called plans, and developing and monitoring those tools to guide development. Planning should be, it is not always, but should be, representative of community vision, actionable and implementable. It should ensure safety, resiliency, accessibility, and should guide places into the future. Planning is also meant to be a democratic tool through which governments here collect, analyze, and report on public needs. So barriers to entry should be lessened, and planning should be something that evolves over time. So nothing about a plan should be static. We should kind of always be asking questions. And what is zoning? So zoning is an invisible yet very pervasive tool. It is a legal tool which a city uses to regulate how land is used and developed. And cities do that by assigning parcels of land or lots to particular zoning districts. Zoning dictates what, where, how you can or cannot build on private property. Zoning does not dictate what happens on publicly owned property, so it doesn't dictate what happens, sometimes dictates what happens on the sidewalk. It's a little bit of a, that's a asterisk. Doesn't dictate what happens in the street, doesn't dictate what happens in public parks, although may identify that space is a public park. Zoning is really meant to control private property. And with that being said, it is meant to be rooted in the premise that individual interests do not exclusively outweigh the common benefit. We'll definitely have some talk today about what the common benefit or the public good actually means. And it can be a bit of a rub because it is definitely something that balances against private property rights. Zoning is a separate but related tool to planning, and it is how planning recommendations and decisions become the law. So zoning is actually the law, where planning is policy and policy guidance. I mentioned that zoning talks about how property can be used. These are some examples of how zoning categorizes different properties. In any zoning code, you'll find uses, a use table or a chapter about uses that designate uses as allowed, conditionally allowed, or forbidden in different zoning districts. If a use is forbidden or some other element of development is forbidden, there is a process by which you can get an exception for that. Here in Hartford, that is via our Zoning Board of Appeals, and you would be requesting a variance from the zoning code. Some zoning codes are very specific in terms of uses and how they categorize uses. Some of them are very general. As mentioned, I work in Boston, and the Boston zoning code is 4,000 pages long. By contrast, the Hartford zoning code is 189 pages long. The Boston zoning code is egregious and should not be that long. In the Boston zoning code, up until recently, there were 250 different uses in the code, which also makes no sense because, like, look at what we're talking about when we're talking about uses. How are there 250 different ones? Yeah, good times. Makes my job really easy. So zoning also regulates scale, and here we have just some diagrams around what planners look at and look for when projects come in, development projects. So planners may be talking about the size of a lot, that's parcel area, the size of a building footprint, different elements related to yards, so setbacks, how far a building is set back from the parcel line, where the property line actually is. A building built all the way to parcel line, you'll hear planners talk about zero lot line conditions. And then with regard to scale again, zoning also relates back to height, both in number of stories and number of feet in a building. Again, with regard to building lot coverage, so some zoning codes, we'll talk about FAR, that's floor area ratio. That's the ratio of the footprint of a building to the size of the lot. The Hartford zoning code does not have FAR in it. It actually regulates things by lot coverage, related a little bit different. The kind of combination of the lot coverage with building height. When you're measuring FAR, you're looking at both the building footprint and the size of the building overall, and it makes it a little bit kind of wonky to figure out the distinctions. The other thing I would note is, so zoning kind of by and large forms an envelope or like the box of a building. Some codes include design standards, which will then create more with relationship to what a building actually looks like beyond that box or that maximum envelope. And some cities, some municipalities, some zoning codes actually have a completely separate process for design review. So you might get much less information in the code itself and then have to go through another kind of bureaucratic step to have the design of your building reviewed. Lastly, zoning also takes into account yards and takes into account both the depth of yards, front, side, and rear, and oftentimes what can be in your yard as well. So zoning is a power that is afforded to municipalities by the state. The state has language in the general statutes around what cities can and cannot do through zoning. And what that means is that it also varies a lot state to state. So from one state to the next, you'll have a lot of different kinds of rules, responsibilities, processes, et cetera. Zoning is definitely one of many different tools that can be used to think about and conceptualize development. What are other policy tools that you know that cities have or use? Historic preservation is one. Yep, tax abatement is one. Jonathan, I saw you. Okay. I can't see the chat, so I don't know if anybody's talking in it. So if someone does want to let me know, I'd be happy to also acknowledge folks in the chat. And so historically, zoning was meant to separate land uses and people, and we're going to dig a little bit into that.
No one in the chat right now. But
okay, great.
You know.
So there are two main types of zoning. Euclidean zoning, also referred to as conventional zoning. The name Euclidean comes from Euclid, Ohio, and a court case in 1926 where a judge ruled that, quote, very often the apartment house is a mere parasite on a neighborhood, circling back to that separating houses and people. And this is a type of zoning that many cities have had over time, and oftentimes part of the reason why many cities have as many kind of spatial justice issues as they do. Many municipalities, as they look to kind of redo their zoning, are moving away from Euclidean zoning and towards form-based zoning. Form-based zoning focuses on the built form itself and the relationship of buildings to the street. It also includes more by way of design standards and thinks more about how either focuses less on use specifically or intentionally thinks more about how uses interact with one another and can be harmonious close to one another. The Hartford Code has some focus on uses, but is a form-based code. It also classifies building forms and which types of buildings are allowed in which districts. It was redone in 2016 to the form-based code format. Some critiques of form-based code include that it can be really too prescriptive. So some codes have a lot of detail in them with regard to like what windows can look like and what materials can go on the front of buildings and things like that. And you end up really kind of creating or creating the risk for homogeneous design of communities and design that maybe doesn't reflect the kind of varied culture in communities as well. Another critique of form-based code is that it can affirm inequities that exist because we're already built out and we're building codes. Like I said, the Hartford Code was developed in 2016. The vast majority of the buildings that you see today already existed and came at different points in time where different policy decisions were being made. And so it's important for us to be mindful of that as we think about form-based codes and how they interact with our environment. Some examples, when I worked here in Hartford, one of the things that we would run into often was former commercial corridors, in particular in the North End, corridors that have suffered from disinvestment over time, many of which were rezoned after 2016 to only allow housing. And these are buildings that, you know, maybe some of them are empty, maybe they're not, but they're old storefront buildings with commercial on the ground floor, residential up top. If someone's going to buy one of those buildings and the building is vacant, having to retrofit a ground floor from a commercial space to a residential space maybe isn't what's right for the neighborhood, maybe is cost prohibitive to the project, maybe deters people from redeveloping their properties. So, you know, when we think about that, we think about like the economic, racial, demographics of the North End and what exactly we're perpetuating by not allowing that or by creating additional hurdles with which people have to jump through in order to develop their properties. So that was one of the challenges, and actually we made some changes to the zoning map in relationship to that. Another thing, similarly, some of those old storefront buildings, we made some changes as well to the code to allow that if they were formerly a storefront building, they would be able to essentially reopen and renovate that storefront without having to go through the ZBA. There is a third kind of zoning that I'm not going to talk too much about, but that's performance-based zoning. And that is code that really kind of focuses on how buildings perform and what sorts of you know, kind of policies they further with regard to their performance. One of the things that we were dealing with in Boston not too long ago was trying to have our zoning commission pass regulations for net zero carbon zoning. That was to react to the fact that the state has adopted a new code that provides more by way of sustainable development. We wanted to kind of take it a step further. Our zoning commission did not. Does anyone have questions before I keep going? Yeah. They're not legally required to be consulted, but it is good practice. And I don't know what's happening now, but I know that before we tried our best to make sure they were always notified. Yeah. We can definitely talk more. So, sorry, the question was whether the NRZs always need to be consulted when there's a project that comes forward. And it's not a legal requirement, but we do try, or we did at least try to make sure that they were notified of projects. The city doesn't like require approval from the NRZ or anything like that in order to advance a project, but does want to demonstrate that they've reached out to them. And for anyone who's not familiar, NRZ stands for Neighborhood Revitalization Zone, and those are something that came about, I think it was the 80s or the 90s, through state legislation to address blight in neighborhoods. In Hartford, the NRZ, Hartford has the most NRZs, and the NRZs cover more land area in Hartford than they do in other cities across the state, and the NRZs kind of operate as neighborhood associations here. Any other questions? Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Thank you. Is there zoning for agricultural land use in urban settings?
So that's going to vary from place to place. In Hartford, there is zoning for urban farms. There is like definitely provisions around like what can and cannot be in those spaces, but there is a category for that.
I think there was one other question.
Sorry. Hey, Amy.
Hi.
I didn't catch the first the zoning base code. Can you just say it again for me?
Euclidean, Euclidean.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. All right. I'm going to acknowledge that we are already kind of behind on time and try to breeze through some of this. I do have a couple of videos that I want to show that I feel like will be way more interesting than me talking. So, brief history of zoning. Forgive some of these slides that have like tons of text on them. There's kind of no easy way to like pack a century into a slide. Zoning, before zoning, cities had nuisance laws on their books. Does anyone know what nuisance laws are? Nuisance laws are laws that relate to quiet use and enjoyment of properties and kind of relate to individual property owner feeling some type of way about whatever's happening around them. So that is how a lot of things were kind of regulated and managed from that kind of perspective. You can kind of see here that there were different sorts of provisions that came about over time. New York law restricting tenement buildings to 1.5 times the width of a street. San Francisco banning public laundries in a very racist attempt to zone out Chinese immigrants. In 1907, at the request of the president of the Municipal Art Society, Hartford, Connecticut became the first city in the country to create a permanent city plan commission. So Hartford's Planning and Zoning Commission is actually the first permanent planning commission in the country that was part of the government structure. Before that, cities would essentially gather together bodies of individuals to make decisions about stuff, and then they would disband. Hartford decided they should make sure that that was a part of government kind of always, and the task of the Planning and Zoning Commission was, and still is, to establish and change zoning regulations and the zoning map, to hear applications for projects through different sorts of permitting processes, to recommend a plan of conservation and development, which is what the state of Connecticut calls its comprehensive plan, master plan. You know, you'll hear different terms in different places. So every 10 years, they have to adopt that. To administer subdivision regulations and to make other land use reviews related to the Connecticut general statutes. The Planning and Zoning Commission also reviews the city's capital improvement plan, kind of recommending to the council that they advance on it, and in particular paying attention to any large infrastructural projects that are being made in the capital improvement plan. That's the city budget. And they also review elements related to public works projects, including but not limited to the location of streets, bridges, squares, parks, playgrounds, playfields, aviation fields, parking spaces, public buildings, and public utilities. So the Planning and Zoning Commission in Hartford is a very powerful body They do not require approval of the city council whenever they make decisions. Planning and zoning commissioners are appointed by the city council. So I've had many a conversation with city council members about, if they have concerns about the Planning and Zoning Commission, they should recognize where their power lies, which is putting people on the commission, so that then the commission is empowered to make decisions and advance projects. The Hartford Planning and Zoning Commission is also the Inland Wetlands and Watercourses Commission, so if there's anything that's happening in a floodplain, that is also going to go before them. And in 2016, when the zoning regulations were modified, the Planning and Zoning Commission also became the Design Review Commission. So there used to be a separate design review body. Now there's a requirement in the bylaws of the Planning and Zoning Commission that a landscape architect or other design professional sit on that board to weigh in on design matters. So other things happened in the 1900s. Then in 1916 in New York, rich folks who were shopping were very upset that the warehouses and manufacturers of the things that they were purchasing were building bigger buildings, and they were too close to Fifth Avenue, and they were angry, and the suppliers themselves were angry. And so the city of New York responded by saying, great, thank you so much. We are going to create zoning, and henceforth everyone needs to follow it. So the city put zoning code into effect in 1916. That was the first city to develop a zoning code formally. And after that, other cities decided to do the same. Note again, wealthy shoppers on Fifth Ave were mad, and the city made a code around it. So, okay. I didn't talk about this, but on the previous slide, there was an element about racial zoning and kind of very overt kind of racist practices that were taking place prior to the 2016 zoning code being put in place in New York. After that happened, the Supreme Court outlawed racial zoning covenants, but we still have exclusionary zoning, and we still have lots of things that do the same thing that racial zoning did, just in more covert ways. So, bringing it local. In 1924, West Hartford became the first municipality to enact zoning laws. In 1957, 77% of the towns in the state within a 20-mile radius of Hartford enacted land use agencies, or created land use agencies and adopted codes. And during the 50s, suburban towns were competing against one another to ensure that they were preserving their property values and keeping folks out, such as having a minimum of about 2 acres of land required to construct a single-family home in many suburbs across the state. And that we'll talk about lot size requirements being a very clear tool of exclusion in zoning codes. So I'm gonna play a video and drink some water.
Think of a great street in your city. Older buildings with shops and restaurants on the ground level and apartments and offices above. Lots of people walking around, meeting with friends, and bumping into strangers. A great street is a destination in its own right. Yet in most cities, streets like these have become outdated. You'll need a car to get to where you're going. Once you pick up on it, you can realize how a city's design can really change your life, and how it influences everything from a city's vitality to housing costs, even crime. But how did we get to a place where so many American city streets are bad? To figure out how American cities got this way, you need to go back to the 1920s and 30s, when the modernist planning establishment began tightening zoning regimes that neatly separated commercial, industrial, and residential building. The stated purpose of zoning laws was to prevent nuisances and pollution where people lived, but also to guide developers to build and buyers to live in the single-family home, widely viewed by city planners as incubators of the ideal American family. To do this, city government carved out wide swaths of city land and confined them to single-family homes, typically restricting residency to one family. And this presented some major problems.
So when you zone something for single-family homes as opposed to multifamily homes, it has the effect of making housing units more expensive.
That's economist Sandy Ikeda, and he says that one of the main effects of single-family zoning was to lower the availability of low-income housing.
I mean, very simply, it's more complicated than this, but if you have a lot which can accommodate one big house, let's say for 4,000 square feet, if you could divide that up into 4 smaller units of 1,000 square feet each, the individual units could be sold or rented out at a lower price.
Take a look at this zoning map of San Francisco, with the single-family zoning colored in red. The city is dominated by single-family zoned housing, and that's a major reason why San Francisco's housing costs are the highest in the United States. Cities across the country have begun to build out by heavily regulating the ability to build up, creating scarcity at attractive city centers and bidding up the price closer to city downtowns.
And so the supply has not kept up with this increasing demand. You want people to live in dwellings that have a minimum size, but the consequence of that is people who can't afford that minimum size won't be able to live in those dwellings. And so what are they going to do? Is there a logical stopping point to minimum housing sizes? Why don't you make the minimum house size 2,000 square feet? Then we'd all live in palaces, or 4,000 square feet. Let's make everybody in New York City live in a single family home. That'll solve the problem.
Single-family zoning laws of the 20s and 30s went a long way to realize the vision of cities held by modernist planners. But they weren't enough, and by the 1950s and 60s, cities weren't just blocking traditional urban neighborhoods from being built. Armed with new federal backing, cities gained license to rezone and condemn neighborhoods as blight, often wiping out entire neighborhoods for minor building design infractions, like not having wide enough lawns separating each dwelling. This had the added and often deliberate effect of forcing out poorer minority residents from the city, who tended to live in denser multifamily homes that were disliked by most modernist planners.
The explicit reason was to promote safety. Later on, many of these zoning codes were used to segregate populations, either explicitly by race or by cultural backgrounds.
In place of these neighborhoods, the modernists favored further single-family home building, but they also favored long, wide streets and narrow sidewalks, with the goal of reshaping American cities around the automobile. They would erect massive civic centers and plazas, sometimes with the primary goal of achieving architectural aesthetic, often forgetting the people they were architecting for. And this is when the modernist planners drew a challenger.
A real rebel that everyone points to, and rightly so, is Jane Jacobs.
Uncredentialed and mostly self-trained, Jane Jacobs was a renegade to the status quo in city planning.
Who in 1961 published her great book called The Death and Life of Great American Cities, the opening sentence of which is, "This is an attack on urban planning."
According to Jacobs, the modernist planners failed to see the city at street level and saw cities only from their maps and dioramas.
She started going to some of these places inspired by modernist urban planning and realized they're not being used by the people the way that the designers had intended them. In fact, many of them were not being used at all. The response she got was something like, well, people are too dumb to know how to use this. Or she thought, this is crazy. They should be figuring out how people actually use space and then designing those spaces in a way that will accommodate those uses.
Jacobs hated the modernist wide streets and narrow sidewalks, and she condemned their zoning codes that separated residents from the bustle of restaurants and businesses. She warned that these features would isolate people from one another and made cities unwalkable, making streets less safe and weakening the social capital that springs from unplanned interactions of pedestrians. She wrote, "This isn't the rebuilding of cities. This is the sacking of cities." Jacobs focused on how many of the modernist plans had become more important than the people they were drawn for. In a famous essay, she said that there is no logic that can be superimposed on the city. People make it, and it is to them, not buildings, that we must fit our plans. This people-centric perspective to urban design led Jacobs to emphasize the importance of allowing mixed-use zoning, where businesses and residential buildings intermingle and allow residents to walk to businesses. Jacobs noticed that the more people walking on a street, the more interesting a street becomes, attracting what she called eyes on the street, making residents feel safe from potential crime. And instead of long, endless streets, Jacobs emphasized the importance of short blocks, which encouraged pedestrians to make frequent turns and take alternating routes, giving businesses off the beaten path a fighting chance by not favoring any one path to begin with. And with businesses scattered throughout neighborhoods, the city suddenly opens up to pedestrians.
If you understand how a city works or an economy works, it's a result of a lot of people following their own plans. It generates outcomes that nobody can predict.
This unpredictability of people should make us wary of imposing intricate plans on them. So what can city designers do to avoid making the mistakes of the past?
I would say, be aware of the consequences. Try to take into account the costs of what you're doing. The true city, where experimentation goes on, where you have face-to-face contact, where you have social capital, cannot be completely planned. So you have to be modest. You can't make people use something in exactly the way that you want it to.
The idea of neatly designing our cities is tempting, but learning to appreciate the emergent and complex order of the people who live in them might help us better shape them for the future.
Thoughts or questions with regard to any of that? Yeah. Yeah, definitely. The comment was wider sidewalks make a lot more sense in particular and especially than the ones that we have in the city. Yeah.
I found the comment about the cars, like us planning around the cars, really interesting. And I guess I'm curious, in all of the history, was it the car first or was it the zoning that came? I know Boston's interesting too because their streets are often oriented on how horse and buggy traveled. They didn't really change as the car came in, whereas New York kind of demolished everything and made it on a grid.
Yeah. Hashtag running. Shout out 86GO. I think it's a good question. I think it kind of varies from like city to city, but I think like the confluence of both I have another video that's like 4 minutes long that I was going to play for you that I think I might still play, but that kind of relates to exactly that question, relates to federal policies and federal decisions and the economy and how the economy in the middle of the 1900s impacted some of those decisions as well. Other questions? Anybody in the chat?
No, no one in the chat.
Okay. Who is familiar with the term redlining? Great. That's the question I should have put at the beginning. Okay. With that being said, do you folks want to watch this 4-minute video? It's mostly about redlining. And the reason I'm asking is because I'm trying to be mindful of time and buy a little bit back, but I am also okay to play it. Play it? Cool. Okay. All right. So I'm going to play this video, and then afterwards, I'm going to have us get up and stretch and do a little thought exercise, if that's all right with folks. Okay. I'm also going to like make you guys talk more. Come on. All right, let's go.
In every way imaginable, the consequences of redlining to many Black and brown communities across America meant that those communities had the least and the last of everything. So I want to talk about redlining because this is a term you may have heard, but most people don't actually know the history. In 1933, in the midst of America's Great Depression, when unemployment rates were 25% and millions of people were not only out of work, but many of them were houseless, the federal government, under President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, established an agency called the Home Owners Loan Corporation. Basically, it tried to make home buying much more affordable by subsidizing the cost of building and lending such that people would be able to afford to buy for the first time. Millions of Americans participated, except that when the Homeowners Loan Corporation began to issue mortgages, it came up with a scheme to decide which communities were deserving of loans and which ones weren't. They made maps and used a color-coded scheme. Green meant this was a community that you could lend to, and red meant you could not. The basic decision they made was to determine that any community with the presence of black people or brown people or people who perhaps spoke Italian in certain parts of the country could not receive support from the Homeowners Loan Corporation. This created a system that came to be known as redlining, because communities that were deemed risky by the mere presence of people of color, most especially black people, were disqualified from getting direct support from the federal government to purchase homes. This policy lasted until 1968, when the federal government passed the Fair Housing Act, which made all forms of discrimination in the buying and selling or renting of homes illegal. But the truth is that the legacies of redlining from that moment to the present meant that black people were subjected to other forms of exploitative lending. A system called contract buying grew up as a way to sell black people homes on a layaway plan. You made set payments over an extended period of time, but you never owned the home until the very last payment. It was very common for unscrupulous sellers to withhold that final payment in an effort to take back the home from a person who had worked incredibly hard to buy it. Home ownership has been the most important asset that a typical white family has in order to do simple things like borrow money to send a child to college. But most importantly, they have financial freedom. But for communities that have been subjected to redlining, they didn't have those advantages. Not only that, the very communities that they lived in suffered from divestment, including the lack of grocery stores, the lack of businesses, the imposition of federal highways that often bisected their communities. In every way imaginable, the consequences of redlining to many black and brown communities across America meant that those communities had the least and the last of everything. And to this day, the median wages and income of those communities and the financial insecurity that people who live in redlined communities face has long-term health consequences for families, has educational consequences for young people whose schools often don't have the tax basis to give them the same resources that communities that were never redlined actually have.
So, thanks for humoring me. This is a redlining map of Hartford. This map was made in 1937, and I'm curious about what thoughts or observations people have about this map, and about what you know about the city and how you experience the city today. That's the north side of Hartford, that's the river. The red part is Clay Arsenal. Folks who don't live in Hartford, do you know where we are right now? Clay Arsenal. Other thoughts?
If folks could just use the mic just for the recording.
So some of the red parts along the river at one point were heavily Italian and black. So like Columbus Boulevard, why it's named Columbus Boulevard, it was a primarily Italian neighborhood. That was also an area where Constitution Plaza is now.
Yep.
So a few years after this, with urban renewal, all that was torn down, and we got Constitution Plaza.
Yep. I believe the southern part, where the red part, correct me if I'm wrong, Jonathan, but that was formerly called the Bottom, the neighborhood. I think it was called the Bottom. It was the Italian part of town. Yeah?
Was the berm built, and when was the last major flood in Hartford? I know that there were several
Yeah.
over time. It's 55.
Jonathan, if you know the answer, please feel free. I know that there's a marking down, if you go down to Riverside Park,
Yeah.
under the highway, it's marked with the date. I do not remember exactly what the date is.
I think there were two, one in the 30s and one in the 50s.
Right. Okay. So that's what I was thinking. So if we had these 2 points in the 30s and the 50s, that essentially kind of, if we think about kind of where the water ended up, was that a marker for redevelopment and pushing people out in the time span afterward? That impacted sort of the way Hartford is developed at this point.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and I'm speaking just my opinion, right? History is layered and complex, and oftentimes decisions are interrelated, whether we realize them or not. But zoning, right, got first enacted in 1916. West Hartford got zoning 1924. Redlining in Hartford 1937. Zoning in Hartford came about probably about 15 years later. So after we've already had this redlining. This is also the advent of urban renewal, as was mentioned. The advent of the automobile, and we cannot ignore where the highway is, and in relationship to this map either. So, I think all of those things probably is the answer. Yeah. Any other thoughts? Okay. So we're going to get up for a few minutes. I have Post-it notes over on this little table. We're going to do a little exercise. We put a couple of timelines in this room with the tile. They are timelines that speak to change in this individual area. If any of you are kind of fluent in local plans, you'll recognize the images. They're from the small area gateway plan, the Arrowhead plan. I'm going to ask you to plug in anything using a Post-it note along the timeline. Plug in anything that comes to mind. We've talked about some of them already, related to cultural or land use history in Hartford, either from yours or your family's experience or just broadly. So did someone in your family buy a house? Did your family immigrate here? If so, from where? Did some other groundbreaking thing happen in this country? And I just want to kind of build a collective map together. We'll take probably about, I'm going to cut it down. We'll take like 10 minutes. Thanks. And I just, before we kind of jump back into things, I was wondering if anyone had any specific thoughts or things that kind of came up for them as they were either reading other folks' posts or putting their own in there, or any additional thoughts with relationship to the redlining map.
Now that we have the phase of time where private equity is in kind of like large conglomerates are buying up whole neighborhoods at a time and then sitting on them until God knows when, are we sort of again on a, I mean, granted it's happening all around the country, but I think we're also seeing the impacts of that methodology of accumulating wealth into a smaller set of hands impacting neighborhoods here in Hartford. And are there any steps, are we seeing that happening along these same corridors that we've seen before? And two, is there anything besides code enforcement when who knows how many code enforcement people we actually have out there doing anything. But the code enforcement process or whatever, what are there steps that the city can think about taking to preserve some of these houses and some of these opportunities for people in some of these neighborhoods that would otherwise get purchased up and held on to for an indefinite amount of time?
Hello. Okay. So first of all, thank you for the comment. It makes me feel like I'm doing something right because we're kind of going in that direction in this conversation. But also, I think like a couple of things came to mind that are not necessarily Hartford specific, but I'll throw out anyway. Kind of when it comes to that accumulation of wealth, there are like some real differences in different cities and the ways that they kind of conduct things with relationship to zoning. One of the things that blows my mind the most in Boston, which is second most expensive after San Francisco right now, is that when you get a zoning entitlement, so you get approved to build a lab, or you get approved to build a like luxury hotel, you have approval to build that forever. Yeah. So like literally. And thank you so much because I did that in a staff meeting with my team the other day and no one knew what I was talking about. So literally like here in Connecticut, in Hartford, you go for your zoning approval, you have a period of time within which you need to go get building permits or you got to go back to the drawing board. In Boston, when you go get your zoning permits, you just have your zoning permits. So I could just sit and wait until I feel like my lab is gonna make way more money and then I'll build it. And I don't have to do anything else because I'm good to go. Conversely, which is interesting and also blows my mind, I talked a little bit about variances earlier, and variances being exceptions from the zoning code that are approved by the Zoning Board of Appeal. Zoning Board of Appeals here, Zoning Board of Appeal in Boston. In Connecticut, when you get a variance, that variance runs with the land. So if I say and because of that, it's harder to get variances for uses in Connecticut. It's much more likely that you get a variance for like, I don't know, my building is gonna be 5 feet closer to my side property line than the zoning allows. There's a higher burden of proof. These are like quasi-judicial hearings. In Boston, when you get a variance, your variance is only good for 2 years. So you do have to go back for a new variance. You don't have to go back for your project. I don't understand why. It's very bizarre. I know. It's weird. The other thing I was gonna say was that, so I also used to work in Louisiana, and Louisiana has very interesting property laws. They operate under what's called Napoleonic law. And one of the elements of the law there is that there's actually like provisions against amassing large like numbers of parcels. And you essentially get like taxed higher if you're just like holding on to lots of land. And if you're just buying up lots of land. So also kind of interesting. Yeah. Was there another question? Oops, sorry, wait for the mic.
Thanks. So the state of Connecticut is the one that theoretically could override like a Hartford zoning ordinance code. So could you override Hartford zoning ordinance at the state level to allow for more affordable housing and things like that?
So we have strong like home rule in the state of Connecticut, which essentially means that like the towns have a lot of power, right? I'm gonna turn this back on. Sorry, I realized I'm sitting in the dark. So the towns have a lot of power. We have 169 towns. They are all completely landlocked. There is no land in the state of Connecticut that is just state land and there's no such thing as counties here. Don't let anybody lie to you. Hartford County doesn't exist. The reason that there's no such thing as counties is we have like lines drawn around like what qualifies as a county, but in other states, counties actually have county government or county taxes, or we don't have that. So we don't have counties. Where was I going with this? What was your question? Oh. Yes. Got it. Okay, so a couple things. So you can change the use of a parcel. You can go to the city and like request to either change the zoning or request to change the use, which like the zoning might allow for commercial, and within commercial, it's like you could be a retail shop, or you could be a yoga studio, or you could be a restaurant, right? So you can change your use. And you can also go and say, I want to change my zoning. I don't want to be commercial anymore. There's rules around this, but so there are like some guidelines, but I'm going to oversimplify. I don't want to be commercial anymore. I want to be like just residential, and this is why, right? And you're going to go to the Planning and Zoning Commission, and they're going to tell you, great idea, we love it, or like, absolutely not, right? So you can do that at the municipal level. The state is the entity that gives the city the power to be able to make those decisions. So if there are policies that get passed at the state level, if the local law, like zoning laws, contradict that, then you automatically go to what the state says, right? There are some states that have like a lot kind of like more specific or more of a hand in kind of like what happens across municipalities. Massachusetts, for example, they have, Boston's weird, y'all. In Massachusetts, they have, the state, the Commonwealth has a law on their books called 40B. 40B, thank you. 40B. 40A is their zoning enabling language. 40B is a provision for percent affordable units that every town has to satisfy, right? Like kind of to your question. Boston is not subject to any of 40A or 40B. So Boston has its own provision in the state statutes that give it its own power to develop its own policies with regard to zoning, and it's not subject to any of the affordable housing crimes. It's the Wild West. Does that answer your question, kind of? Okay. Are there any other questions? All right, I'm gonna keep it moving. All right. So, I'm gonna talk about urban renewal, speaking of Boston. This is just a poem I thought was really sweet to kind of introduce this conversation. The place that I call home is humble, and its creaky floorboards have seen us all in our most vulnerable state. Grandma and Grandpa dancing barefoot in the living room, the shuffle of their feet becoming the musical selection of the evening. These door frames have held up dreams, hoisted them upon their broad shoulders, and offered them up to the skies. That front door has warmly greeted kind souls, and the back has banished offenders. I once mopped the floor with Mama's tears, and the scent of Grandma's sweet potato pie will forever haunt this kitchen. In the confines of these walls, 3 of my cousins were born, and now you tell me you want to take this place away for the greater good. Who's good? So even as governments enacted anti-discrimination laws over the kind of course of the century, they carried out a practice known as urban renewal. Who's heard of that before? Got it. Which actively accelerated the decline of non-white communities made ready for quote-unquote redevelopment through decades of disinvestment. Using eminent domain, who's heard of that before? Got it, cool. Local government snatched up the homes and businesses of Black and immigrant communities at rock-bottom prices, replacing them with commercial development or homes for wealthier families. Displaced residents were left to seek shelter in segregated markets or in poorly managed public housing units. If anyone's interested, just kind of as an aside, interested in learning more about urban renewal and kind of effects of urban renewal and like community organizing out of urban renewal, I highly recommend checking out the book Streets of Hope. Streets of Hope. It's about Roxbury in Boston. It is about an organization called the Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative, and it is a very good read, and also just a kind of cool visit in case you're ever up in Boston. This got cut off. It says to build housing, Boston gives away land Black and brown families once owned. And I am going to play a podcast for you. I'm going to ask you to kind of read through some of the quotes from this article that are on the slide. And then I have a couple of questions after this is done. It's 4 minutes. After this is actual 4 minutes this time, swear. After this is done, some Post-it notes, and would love for folks to kind of think a little bit about some of the questions that are over on the wall.
This is GBH's Morning Edition. The city of Boston is giving away dozens of vacant lots in Dorchester to local developers to build affordable housing. But property records show local families used to own these lots, and some of those families want them back. GBH's Paul Singer has more from the GBH News Center for Investigative Reporting.
Pam Saucer Richardson and her sisters are standing in front of a Dorchester vacant lot that their father used to own.
There was a beauty salon here. My stepmother used to do hair. It was a building, it was a building with storefront.
The property on Erie Street is one of 150 vacant lots that the city of Boston is giving away to mostly small, minority-owned developers to build affordable housing. In January 2023, Mayor Michelle Wu announced that the city would use millions of dollars in federal COVID relief money for a housing program called Welcome Home Boston.
We also have 150 vacant lots in our neighborhoods ready for housing. Local builders, work with us to design high-quality, affordable homes that enhance the surrounding neighborhood, and we'll give you the land for free.
Most of the lots in the program have been vacant for decades, but that doesn't mean they've always been abandoned, as former State Senator Diane Wilkerson pointed out at a meeting last year of the city's reparations task force.
And guess who has more vacant land than anywhere else? Roxbury and Dorchester. And it's vacant because the city bulldozed Black people's houses and businesses.
That's exactly what happened to James Saucer, Pam's father. He lost the land to a city tax lien in the early 1990s. The city has now agreed to give it to a group called African Community Economic Development of New England to build housing. The nonprofit serves Boston's African immigrant and refugee population with social services and job training, but it has never before built housing. Leaders there declined to speak to GBH News. The vacant lots show a pattern. Black and Latino families bought homes decades ago, then lost them to tax liens and other charges. Russ Lopez, a local historian, says the properties were often in bad shape and families struggled to get the loans to upgrade them.
The emotional toil that these poor families went through, the sleepless nights, right? The worry, that the phone was going to ring, right, and somebody demanding money, or something would break and you couldn't fix it.
Reverend Kevin Peterson runs a grassroots reparations task force called the Boston People's Reparations Commission. He says the city should not be giving this land away.
I think the city should focus on how to repair its relationship with Black people. And part of that would be through returning land to Black people who lost it through discriminatory practices.
City officials don't talk about the Welcome Home Boston program in terms of reparations, but they do emphasize that affordable housing is another approach to repairing neighborhoods that have suffered from decades of economic exclusion. Here's Alexander Stirk, the spokesman for the city's Office of Housing.
the intent of the program is really to offer home ownership opportunities for people that live in the neighborhoods that these houses are being built in, which by their nature tends to be, families that have lived there for a period of time or, have been displaced and want to come back to their neighborhoods.
Pam Saucer Richardson says her family would love to come back to Erie Street.
What, if anything, can be done? What kind of money is needed? What do we need to do? Go to the city. You guys did this. How can you help us?
But for now, her family doesn't appear to have a path back to the land her father used to own. In Dorchester, Paul Singer, GBH News, 89.7.
Okay. I am looking at the time, so I'm actually not going to have us do Post-it notes, but maybe if folks have any thoughts about what kind of stands out in what you just heard or in any of the quotes that are up on the board. I forget what the questions were that I put over here. What concerns do we have about unintended consequences of this plan? What trade-offs do you think the city will, no, wrong, sorry, ignore me, totally wrong. Ignore that entirely. Sorry. So, no, I just want to know what kind of stands out for folks. And I think like what I was thinking about here is that kind of point about trade-offs, because I think a lot of the discussion out of the article is also with relationship to trade-offs and with relationship, I think perhaps to sometimes where, at least from my own vantage point, it's really difficult to work for government because there are other ways that our hands end up tied in how we can kind of make decisions and move forward. And in this instance, certainly everything that is being said is both very important, very valuable, very resonant. But I'm just interested in that, yeah.
Just hearing it is making me think about the land bank.
Yeah.
And I had serious issues with the land bank. They redeveloped a property around the block from me that sold for this price that's like 5 times what anyone living in the neighborhood currently would be able to, or most people living in the neighborhood right now would be able to afford. It also reminds me of over on, I believe it's either Irving Street or Magnolia Street, where they shut down the park because eventually they're going to be building something there, so nobody could go hang out in the park. And now they have these new things that they're trying to get people to not be allowed to be on the street. So they're giving no place for anybody to actually stay and socialize because they closed off the park. And now you have to buy a pass in order to park on your own street if you live on that street.
Yeah, so put in residential parking?
Yeah. So it's just making me think of those things that are going on right now in Hartford.
Yeah, definitely.
It sounds like maybe well-intentioned people in the government, once again, like did this thing without actually trying to engage with the community at all, and that was like the major shortcoming.
Yeah, I hear that for sure. Other thoughts? I think one of the things that I agree with all of that, and I think one of the things that like comes to mind for me is I almost wonder what conversations took place internally with staff. I wonder how those conversations kind of manifested themselves in the context of like the complexities of bureaucracy, because with those properties being owned by the city now, the city has to comply with procurement standards and a whole bunch of other like legal and red tape type things. Like they actually legally can't just go say, here, you should have this. And that's like a terrible place to be like as a human, and also a really hard place to be as a bureaucrat. And one of those ways that we acknowledge that government's not necessarily set up to serve us always. So, yeah. I'm going to keep going. Oh, sorry. Did you want to say something?
I know we're specifically talking about like cities in Hartford, but I found that like, so I just moved up here from the southeast a little bit over 3 years ago, and I found like a lot of these issues like are just brought to the cities and now city problems. I found that like there was a decent amount of diversity in Hartford. I spent a lot of time in New Britain. That was fantastic. But then I worked in a small town in like the first job that I got here, and it was pretty well paid, and I was doing just fine. And I asked one of my like peers who just so happened to work for the city, what would draw people who look like me into their small town? And his answer, knowing what my paycheck looked like, was, well, Section 8's full. And I was like, you know, like how much I get paid. How much do you, like, what would draw me here? What would draw other people here? Because it seems like, yes, specifically in the map that you showed historically, redlining was in this portion of the city, but I'm finding that like maybe we're like outlining certain areas of Connecticut specifically to be for people of color, and then people who, then it's fine that like these areas are left alone with more land available to private owners who are white.
Yeah.
So are those like conversations happening at a broader scale, I guess?
Yeah. I think like maybe two things come to mind in that. I think one of the things that, frankly, like whether you kind of work for government in Hartford or involved in some other way, shape, or form, that you're kind of like always mindful of is like pretty much everything in the city is like based on property taxes, right? That's the way that we fund everything. And we're the capital. We have an enormous amount of non-taxable land in the city. We have the hospitals, we have, institutions, we have a higher percentage of churches, right? And all of those things are like good, right, for the state, but because of the way that the state is set up, because of kind of the home rule, because of the fact that there are no counties, because of all of that, right, we're actually shouldering the burden for all of those other towns. And then, right, conversely, in those other towns, we talked a little bit about like zoning and the kind of advent of zoning, and in the 20s and 30s, all of those minimum lot size requirements that were put in place elsewhere. When you're paying for property, you're paying for the land. You're paying for the improvements, but you're paying for the land. And if you have to buy a property that is, 2 acres in order to put a house on it, and you can't put anything else on it from like a physical improvement standpoint, you automatically like jack up the price, you jack up the value because supply is short and demand is high, right? So it's definitely a problem of our own making, and definitely related to race and the history of this country.
Around kind of to your point of there's a lot of effort to expand the share of affordable housing that exists in other towns, and many of the other towns fight it tooth and nail, right? And they go out of their way to come up with any version of, you can't build that here. We want affordable housing, just not here. We want it somewhere, just somewhere else. And so you're seeing that, for example, over in Simsbury, it's not even actually that much of an affordable housing development. It's a multi-use, multi-family condo sort of development that's been pushed back again and again and again, I think, over the course of the past 3 to 5 years. And that would bring an additional I think it was a few hundred units into Simsbury where people who have essentially working class jobs could afford to buy or rent, but they've pushed that back. And that's happening all around Connecticut. So there are several organizations that do a lot of work to push cities to do that. However, we have 169 different towns, and there's no coordination between them. So everyone wants to look to someone else and push it to the next town over, which with 169 towns and the second smallest state in the country is like 2 blocks away. But they want to keep that, but they push it 2 blocks away, and they push it 2 blocks away, and then it ends up in Hartford.
I was just thinking from the podcast, what stood out is Mayor Wu saying that they were going to give the land away for free for $0, which it's just a reminder that Black and brown people are supposed to shoulder or just sacrifice our own ability to build wealth or any type of reparations or for that land that could have accumulated wealth within these families and communities for the greater good that like we're talking about.
Best laid plans, right?
Did you want us? You go ahead. Yeah.
I just wanted to build off of the last point where it's like, if they're literally going to be giving the land away for free now and they've done nothing with it in the meantime, then what was the point of them displacing people from it in the first place? Because it's like, they didn't even end up doing, not that it would have been better if they had like repurposed it in some way, but like, there would have been like a form of logic behind the city's actions, which there doesn't really seem to have been. They're just like, you owe taxes, land's not yours anymore, we're gonna keep it empty.
Yeah, there's this like real question about points in time. I had a conversation with some of my colleagues the other day about like political moments and like the ripeness for like different decisions, policy-wise and otherwise, in political moments. When administrations change and their priorities change, right? And how, Malana, I think Joe needs you. And how like the policies then change with them.
There's someone else up there.
I think a little bit about, you know, Hartford in like 2017, I think, created the blight ordinance, which then eventually created the land bank. And the blight ordinance was because of blighted property, but it was a way for the city to be able to kind of go through similar processes where they're like, have the power to fine, can use those liens, can take property away. On the one hand, you don't want folks to be living in neighborhoods where there's blight, right? On the other hand, there are impacts to that for the individuals who own those properties, and life is more complicated than just like, I didn't cut my grass. And the land bank was created out of that so that the city could essentially have a means of disposing with proper, disposing is not a good word, but selling property in a way that doesn't trigger as many of the like red tape elements that we're talking about here, right? But again, you know, we're still reaping like unintended by consequences out of that as well. So.
That was the other thing that stood out to me, because if I'm not mistaken, I heard them say that they were giving the land to Black and brown developers.
Correct.
So that's kind of like, oh, well, you know, we're doing our part for racial justice, but meanwhile they're taking it out of the hands of black and brown families. So they're basically just transferring it from transferring it to wealthy people. They're Black and brown wealthy people, but you're still taking it out of the hands of the people who it belongs to already. And that's what strikes me. That's what strikes me also is what the land bank has been doing.
Anybody else? Okay, we're in the home stretch. Does anybody object to going a little bit past 3 o'clock? I will not be mad if you got to get up and go, though. Okay. All right. Home stretch, I promise. All right. I have one more video for you. Last one. You may or may not recognize where it's talking about. And then we're going to talk a little bit about zoning really specifically and zoning into the future, okay?
Come, let's travel into the future. What will we see?
Sweeping improvements in modern life were predicted in the mid-20th century. There was a growing faith in progress through technology and rational planning.
Each enterprising achievement brings wonderfully new ways of life at our fingertips.
Tomorrow, our dreams will come true.
To a certain extent, today's cities are the products of yesterday's dreams. The Hartford of today embodies many of the last century's hopes and plans for a better, more modern city, but also reflects the unintended outcomes of this sweeping modernist vision. To discover how Hartford changed by a process we now call urban renewal, we have to look back. After World War II, returning Hartford troops paraded through streets that looked pretty much the same as they had decades before. The downtown neighborhoods were compact and walkable. It was a downtown built before the automobile. Homes, businesses, and shops occupied the same buildings on the same blocks. There was a street life, a vibrancy, a sense of community. But Hartford was seeing deterioration in some of its earliest neighborhoods, like older cities across the country. And like other cities, Hartford's economic growth was limited by traffic congestion, a scarcity of undeveloped land, and an aging building stock, conditions that had already prompted some of Hartford's major businesses to move out. To sustain the booming growth of the 20th century, the city needed to find room for office buildings and make way for cars and trucks. The U.S. government addressed these problems of urban growth and decay with the 1949 Federal Housing Act. The act marked the beginning of the urban renewal era. Over the next 25 years, it would allocate billions of dollars in federal funds to cities to demolish neighborhoods designated as slums or blighted, and prepare the land for redevelopment. Hartford's leaders, like those across the country, eagerly took advantage of these federal programs. The city targeted 4 areas for redevelopment, areas known today as Constitution Plaza, Windsor Street, Bushnell Towers, and the Civic Center. Constitution Plaza was the first. Completed in 1965, it targeted the city's historic immigrant neighborhood around Front Street.
This is Constitution Plaza in Hartford, a pioneering project in imaginative urban renewal. It contains a landscape pedestrian mall stretching over the city's streets, as well as 8 major office buildings, all in the center of downtown Hartford. Many people think it will become a pattern for forward-looking cities all over the country.
The plaza was designed with cars in mind. The new National Interstate Highway System, authorized by President Eisenhower in 1956, encouraged longer commutes in suburban development. The age of the automobile had arrived. I-91, completed in 1964, cut Hartford off even more from the river and sparked growth in suburbs. Meanwhile, I-84 isolated the city's north end from the downtown, reinforcing the city's racial segregation with a physical barrier. The Windsor Street project, beginning in 1961, demolished 70 acres of residences, stores, and light industry in the largely African-American and Italian neighborhood known as the Bottom. Neighborhood residents were led to believe that their demolished homes would be replaced with new units on site. But the area was never fully rebuilt and now contains highway ramps, parking lots, a college, and commercial development. Because of discrimination, black residents found it more difficult to relocate than their Italian counterparts, many of whom were able to take advantage of new government-backed mortgages that were denied to minority groups. The only one of 4 sites on which new housing was built was Bushnell Plaza, which replaced an area of small bookstores, restaurants, and 2 theaters. Originally designed to include 2 luxury high-rises on the edge of Bushnell Park, only 1 apartment tower was built. The Civic Center, finished in 1975, replaced 2 square blocks of shops, theaters, and hotels at Asylum and Trumbull Streets. In their place, a sports arena and indoor mall were constructed, in hopes of competing with suburban malls for shoppers. This was the last major project of the urban renewal era in Hartford. In the years since, urban renewal has been heavily criticized. In Hartford, as in cities all over the country, many now feel that redevelopment drained the vitality from the city's center, leaving the downtown with too many office buildings and parking lots, and with few homes or destinations to bring the streets alive outside of working hours. But today, Hartford is changing again. New projects are bringing apartments, shops, and restaurants in among the office buildings, important steps towards recreating a vibrant city center. The effects that urban renewal and redevelopment had on Hartford are still being debated, even as new changes are taking place around us. What will these changes bring? What will they mean for the people who live and work here? How will today's dreams shape the Hartford of tomorrow?
Come, let's travel into the future. What will we see?
There's a great, big, beautiful tomorrow.
Whoops. Sorry. So, that video is obviously not new. It's actually not as old as I thought it was. It was made in 2005, I think. The thing that struck me the most about that video is it says that, what's that? Oh, yeah, the lights. Yeah. The thing that struck me the most about that video the first time I watched it is that it says that the Civic Center was the last major urban renewal project. That is not true anymore. It was at the time that that was made. Who knows what the last major urban renewal project was? Say it louder for the people in the back. Dunkin' Donuts Stadium. I know. I wrote my senior thesis about that. All right, so here we are. So these are spreads from the Arrowhead Gateway Small Area Plan, and we're going to talk a little bit about that and a little bit about zoning. And I'm actually just going to read a section from the plan. The Arrowhead Gateway has a rich historic and cultural legacy that continues to shape the neighborhood today. The Arrowhead Gateway neighborhood has long been home to a diverse population. Waves of first Irish and Jewish, then African American, then Puerto Rican and Caribbean immigrants came to the area and put down roots, opening businesses, establishing traditions, and creating community. Today, the neighborhood is more than 2/3 African American and 1/3 of the population identifies as having Hispanic origin. Significant disinvestment following the construction of Interstate 84 and a wave of civil disturbances in the 1960s and 70s has made the neighborhood one of the poorest areas in the city, where residents struggle with poverty and the physical environment is marked by deterioration and vacancy. Despite these issues, the neighborhood maintains a strong sense of community and cultural diversity that continues to make it a vibrant home for business, culture, and the arts. And just by way of kind of what's on the slide, there's a little bit more about kind of the history of the area. This is an overlay of that redlining map that we saw previously. And this is the study area that the plan took place in. We're here. These are changes to the geography over time, and the last has an overlay of the census tracts. This plan was completed in 2022, so that's as of 2022. So zoning has come a long way. It has been super harmful. There have been lots of repercussions that we are still living with today, as you can see. As a planning director, I spend a lot of time thinking about and talking about how to kind of, I say this a little bit painfully, but work within the system that I am a part of to be able to try to affect change into the future. And with the tools that I have and that my colleagues have, how can we try to use them differently? This is from the Brookings Institute. It is a kind of theory of change around placemaking, in particular with relationship to planning and zoning. And it is meant to kind of think about things in three ways. One, with relationship to scale. How do we concentrate investments not only in public spaces, individual lots or city blocks, but in hubs or districts where economic, physical, and civic assets can cluster and connect and create an economic ecosystem that is regionally connected and locally rooted. In terms of investment, how do we think about placemaking as a way to encourage investment, to create high quality places, but to foster equitable and opportunity-rich neighborhoods and communities and promote community health and resiliency. And from an integration perspective, how do we seek to break down barriers between key fields to advance systems level solutions and advance community history and identity and inclusive network building. When we think about zoning, we think about it kind of with three prongs. The rules, so the code itself, which we talked a bit about, the people, and then the zoning map, which you saw for Hartford way back when at the beginning of this presentation. So how do we kind of, using those three things, how do we think a little bit more about equity, and how do we use some of the tools that we have to think about how we break down and mitigate inherent bias? This is an excerpt from the Hartford zoning code now. We are in a DT3 district, so all the way on the end. But the reason that I have it on the screen is because there are bits and pieces of the code as we kind of think about building design that are in some ways meant to kind of address some of the kind of limitations that existed before. So the city of Hartford doesn't have any parking minimums. The city of Hartford does have parking maximums. We have bike parking requirements for properties. We have, let's see, what else? We have gotten rid of all of our minimum lot size requirements. We do have maximum lot size requirements now. And just other like little bits and pieces of the code that are meant to try to chip away at some of the things that we talked about. It is not a perfect document. I am sure plenty of you have had very painful and annoying experiences with it. I too have had painful and annoying experiences with it, but I think that there are some really important elements that exist in the code that are just important to be aware of. Sorry again, it was 3 o'clock in the morning by this point in time in the slide deck. So I was just throwing stuff on there. So these are just ways that cities kind of across the board can be thinking about how, from a planning and zoning perspective, to be able to, begin to actively address, oh my God, this is a terrible slide, I'm so sorry. Actively address, the history, the inequitable history of planning and zoning decisions. So, and this kind of concept of reverse disinvestment, which is to specifically say that we're going to, from an equitable lens, really place our focus on neighborhoods that have been historically ignored, and to really focus on investing funding, time, meaningful kind of interaction in those spaces rather than focus on the things that feel like low-hanging fruit. To work to mitigate displacement. So to do that in a number of different ways. One of those ways could be something like inclusionary zoning, which is a policy that, speaking a little bit to, I'm sorry, I don't know your name, but gentleman in the front, speaking a little bit to kind of your comments about states requiring affordable units. Cities can also set policies to require affordable units in development. And that is one of the ways with which to do that. The other way is really to just be more coordinated. Yeah, it's wild. There are a lot of different departments working on different things and different tools that really can be used to mitigate displacement and to work towards mitigating displacement. But as a member of the public, I shouldn't have to bear the burden of having to know where to go and who to talk to figure that out. So how, as a city, do I put that all in one place and make it easy to access? Another thing on here is to think more critically, and this is really more about a mix of uses, but to think more critically about how we think about uses and their compatibility. Oftentimes, and I think you mentioned some of this at the beginning of the talk, but there are folks who are making things, who are doing dope things, who should not have to go find like an expensive studio to be able to do that in. You should be able to do it from your home, or you should be able to do it, you know, in your garage, or you should. So how do we think about how we mix those uses together in ways that create opportunities for wealth for individuals? And then how do we think a little bit more and more intentionally around our agricultural use regulations? And I know a lot of you have that kind of specific interest, and certainly thinking about local foodways, local food production, you know, as a means to both better outcomes for communities and you know, more affordability is certainly a way that cities can be impactful. This is another long 3 a.m. slide. I talked about some of these, but thinking about transit-oriented development because the cheapest commute is not in a car. Thinking about things like accessory dwelling units because folks want to be able to age in place. Getting rid of single-family zoning, getting rid of parking minimums, getting rid of minimum lot size requirements. Thinking about cultural preservation, historically, we've had a lot of conversation about historic preservation from like a design perspective, and historic preservation can also be a thing that is good, but also can make communities more expensive, can have exclusionary effects rather, and doesn't always value like the things that, unless you're a design professional maybe, or, I mean, don't get me wrong, I love the Victorian houses in Hartford, but you know, doesn't always necessarily protect from some of the kind of cultural elements of communities. How do we shorten permitting processes? How do we work to vary and improve forms of engagement, make them more meaningful, and think about co-design in our work with communities? And then I added this piece about farming and agriculture specifically, because I know there was interest in kind of talking about that. I'm happy to answer more questions about that. A couple of data points really quickly before I jump in to that, going back to the last column. Desegregate Connecticut did a study. It is back there unless somebody grabbed it. And one of the findings that they had was that if municipalities across the state of Connecticut reduced their average minimum lot size by 50%, so right, a lot of the other municipalities still have minimum lot sizes, that would enable like a massive amount of land for development of housing, and B, would lower home prices because of the cost of land and the cost of property, lower home prices by approximately $26,900 on an average. And then moving into kind of the agricultural column, the UConn Center for Land Use Education and Research, UConn Clear, found that between 1985 and 2010, Connecticut lost approximately 190 square miles of forest and 70 square miles of agricultural fields. So from a production standpoint and from a climate sustainability resiliency standpoint, you know, what does that mean for us and how do we balance those things? From a zoning perspective, how do we think more about small scale urban agriculture? In Hartford, you can have community gardens, you can have greenhouses, you can do beekeeping, you can keep chickens as long as they are not roosters. If you have a rooster, it's going to get taken away from you. How do we create, again, more opportunities for manufacturing, for farmers markets, for local food facilities, and reduce barriers for folks to be able to do things like pop-ups, et cetera. I also heard you mention before we started a little bit about kind of production and sales of goods like out of your home, like food goods, and it's worth looking into the state's cottage commercial laws because the state did try to do a lot by way of like reducing kind of barriers to getting a cottage commercial permit and being able to produce things that you can, you know, either be able to sell, whether you're selling online or what have you, or showing up to farmers markets, et cetera. And I'm happy to talk some more about that. This is from the Connecticut Zoning Atlas. I don't have a lot to say about this, I'm not going to lie. The Connecticut Zoning Atlas has kind of grown into the National Zoning Atlas. It was started by Sarah Bronin, former Planning and Zoning Chair in the city of Hartford, is the mayor's wife technically First Lady? Is that how that works? I don't know. I have no idea. I don't know. But this is a really important tool, actually. It does a lot by way of collecting information. We talked before about how municipalities, they're all independent, they're not talking to each other, so on and so forth. This is how we prove that there's a problem. It's data, they've collected data, they've analyzed the zoning codes, and they have teams that are working to kind of keep this stuff up to date. And this is on the website, a series of interactive maps, interactive GIS maps where you can kind of see where only allows single family housing, where we focus on, mixed use development, et cetera, et cetera. And then more broadly, the National Zoning Atlas is doing this state to state. Not all the states are involved in it, but it is also a very cool tool because, like I said before, zoning is a power that is given to municipalities by the state. The state doesn't have to talk to the next state about what they do and do not allow. So kind of being able to better understand land use trends and, processes at that level is also really cool. What time is it? 3:15. I'm going to be very quick. So I included just a little bit more about the arrowhead, and I can actually probably skip over this. This is, again, from the plan, and it's just kind of different development parcels and city-owned parcels in this general area, which I'm happy to come back to if folks want to talk about it. And this is the zoning for this particular area. I will not have us do this exercise, but this was the final exercise, which was with regard to kind of what concerns we have about unintended consequences of this plan, how we might consider to ensure equity is a primary focus of this plan, as it says that it is, and what we might be doing in this space in particular to help to enact the goals of the plan and to kind of embody it. And the goals of the plan are to establish a gateway between Clay Arsenal and downtown, encourage connectivity and improve that terrible intersection out there, ensure development that is cohesive with neighborhood character, existing neighborhood character, support small local BIPOC businesses through TA and financing, and to reinforce a sense of place that reflects cultural heritage and diversity, and then finally to promote affordable homeownership opportunities. So we're at the end. This is a piece of art by an artist named Jenny Holzer. She has a series of pieces called Truisms. And I kind of wanted to kind of close with this, both because I have just thrown so much like government stuff at you, and I need to strike a balance in my spirit on a Saturday. But also, I have just one more kind of quote excerpt. There's a document in the back on the resources table that is about planning without property, and it's an academic writing, and the author, her name's Heather Dorries, says that, she was, I think maybe like defending her thesis or something. She was talking about racial regimes in like land use and property ownership, and someone stood up and said, but what is planning without property? And so she like kind of spends a little time talking about whether that was a comment or a question. And then she says, what is planning without property can be understood in two registers. It is premised on a distinct set of commitments and assumptions. On the one hand, as provocation, this question can be understood as an inquiry into the possibilities for planning beyond the racist and capitalist social order that currently shapes planning. I lost my place. On the other hand, as a gotcha question. It implies that the idea of planning without property is a question in response to nonsensical proposition. It assumes that planning is deeply enmeshed. Sorry, this is cut off, so I'm kind of making it up a little bit. No, I'm just kidding. It assumes that planning and zoning is deeply enmeshed, and that it is possible to imagine, planning and property rather is deeply enmeshed, and that it is impossible to imagine one without the other. It implies not only to planning, but to the racist social order that shapes planning's mainstream ideals. Planning without property would be an approach to planning that would dispense of the assumptions upon which the ownership model of private property is founded. As a something, because it's cut off, I don't know, of this mode of planning would be to focus on identifying, making, and strengthening more than human relationships that flourish in the context of life. Planning without property supports practices of being and belonging rather than practices of exclusion. And interrogation. It's an interrogation of the ways that the racial property regime is replicated and reinforced by this regime. While firmly entrenched in current planning practices, it is not an inevitable context. The question, what is planning without property, is a hopeful question. So, thank you.
So, yeah, first of all, thank you so much, Aimee. That was super informative. Woo. And part of the purpose of this series is really for us to take action, for us to think about like ways that we can shift things in our communities. And I know a lot of folks here are community organizers, so having this information and these tools hopefully to think about, how do we coordinate better our efforts and, make change around land justice in Hartford and throughout the state. And I also want to thank Masam, who made the food. It was delicious. And Joe in the back who's doing the tech. Woo. And we'll be sending out resources. We have a recording of the whole session, so as well as past sessions. So we're going to be putting those all on YouTube and have the whole series up there. And also any other resources like videos and anything that Aimee shared throughout today. And then we'll also share other, future events with you all. So thanks again.